This video is about the SiteAudit Green Reports or sustainability. And the way that the presentation works is that I'll go through a couple of short slides and then I'll move right into the product and show you how that works. So the sustainability reports provide a green audit, and it's used as an ongoing reporting process to measure the fleet's carbon footprint, its power use, and energy costs. It also provides a carbon offset measure, and the target user is typically the MPS provider or end user who's interested in understanding the fleet's carbon footprint. It can be used on an ongoing fleet service with a goal of achieving carbon neutral environment. Basic sustainability measures are that it's going to look at the carbon footprint as measured in the kilograms of carbon per kilogram of plain paper. It'll look at the mitigation or offset as measured by number of trees that have to be planted. It looks at power use, which incorporates the typical weekly energy or electric consumption, TEC rating, device use, and device type. And then fourthly, it looks at power costs, which considers kilowatt hour and device use. So the Green Audit requires that you use SiteAudit version 7 to collect the data, and then you need to have SiteAudit Analyzer, and you get the green report for that. And typically there's a sustainability audit that's used on an ongoing basis. And the steps are: first you run the green audit, then you get the results and you present those results, which I'm going to show in detail in a minute here. Then you do some mitigation effort, and you remove the devices that create the largest carbon footprint and use up the most energy, etc. And that can take, say several months to implement. You rerun the report again, and then you measure your progress. To get the green reports, what you'll need to do is you'll need to have SiteAudit Analyzer version 2, which has been released with SiteAudit 7. You'll need Excel and something called Office Tools, which is also available from the Netaphor homepage download site. So you need those as prerequisites, and then you'll get either an annual license for Analyzer or an audit license, seat license. So one seat can do multiple audits or continuation of the same audit if you like. There's no limitation on use. To get this, you should contact Netaphor at licensing@netaphor.com. So now let's take a look at the tool itself and get to know how that works. So as I mentioned, this is a analyzer report, and it begins with the dashboard, and the dashboard provides an overview of the 3 sustainability issues. What is the fleet's carbon footprint is one. How much mitigation is required to reach say a carbon neutral environment? That's the second one. And thirdly, what are the fleet's power consumption and costs? So you can all see that in the 6 charts that are shown here. Now these are described in these 6 dashboard charts, which also make up 6 of the 8 green reports in the entire Analyzer Green report. Each report or chart can be individually filtered, and then the changes can be recognized in the dashboard. And you can see that here. These are currently all that's is the last change that were made. They're reflective of the changes. Now, if I wanted to make additional changes, let's say if I wanted to take a look at the carbon footprint based on, say, a trend here, and I wanted to make some changes here. Let's say I just wanted to look at that trend as it pertains to Hewlett-Packard. So I could make that change. I see the changes here in the emission, and these are A4 letter uh, emission uh, measurements. And I can go back now to the dashboard, and it reflects those changes that were made there. So any change you make in a chart, you can go back and forth with the dashboard. So now let's look at the next area, which is the parameters. And the parameters are a set of adjustable parameters used to calculate the carbon trend and total carbon footprint. Say the number of trees to offset the carbon footprint, the average kilowatt uh, by device type and cost and use. So all those parameters are set here. And the parameters are adjustable to local conditions. So if for example, the cost per kilowatt is different than what's here, then you can change that. And any time that you want to go back to the default, you just select change back to default, and that'll bring back this set of default values here. So the amount of carbon dioxide, or call it carbon footprint, is always expressed in kilograms. And these are described here in the description over here. The CO2, or the carbon footprint calculation, is based on the kilograms of CO2 emitted in 1 kilogram of standard office paper. And so that value is presented either in A4 letter or A3 large or ledger size pages. The default carbon dioxide equivalent CO2 factor used is 1.9 kilograms per kilogram of plain paper used. And this factors in the paper production, the distribution, fiber materials, and the post-paper use, including recycling, burning, and landfill. That's all included in that carbon footprint. If we look at the offset, the CO2 offset, which is a measure in terms of number of trees, and it's based on a tree having a life of 40 years, then you have an offset if you planted the whole offset in 1 year, or if you planted the offset in the half-life of a tree, or 20 years, or the full life of 40 years as well. Then we look down at the next area of parameters is the power usage, and the variables involved there are the typical weekly electric or energy consumption rating, and the device utilization, specifically the low utilization metric, which, if known, okay, or if the default annual kilowatt for device type and average time devices is in use. And this is presented as a percentage. You can also adjust that as well. The cost of power variable is based on the cost of a kilowatt hour, using either the default cost here, you can see is 20 cents, or by changing it to the local cost. And these parameters impact the charts we're going to look at next. So these are important parameters to consider when you're doing your analysis here. So now let's move to the CO2 trend, and this chart is a carbon footprint trend, and the chart shows the monthly trend based on the CO2 emission from the actual volume for a period monitored. It considers CO2 emissions by paper size, that is the A4 letter, the A3 ledger output, but it also accounts for any duplex printing as well. So a duplex printing produces less carbon for the same number of printed pages as both sides of paper are used. And I want to note here that when you're using trends, that they're based on the monitored period, which may or may not include a full month or quarter. So in this case, we say March, April, and May, and March may have some fewer days than all of March, and the same for May. April would be a full month. And so that would affect the carbon footprint. So it's advised if you're going to really use a trend that you should consider using periods longer than, say, 4 or 5 months, maybe 6 months and beyond. Now there's filtering options allow you to view this carbon footprint by make, model, device type. So if I was to go up here, these are my filtering options here, and I could look at say what the footprint over time was for these departments if I wanted to do that, or if I wanted to look at it by, say, device type, I could say, well, what's the carbon footprint for the multifunction devices? Look at that. I could compare that. Now I'm looking at Hewlett Packard, but let's look at all of the devices here, and you'll see how it changes. And I'm looking now at all the models here. So that's our filtering when we look at the CO2 emission trend. Now let's go to the next chart. We're looking at the annualized CO2 or carbon footprint, and it's based on the daily volume by device the paper usage, and then it's normalized over a year's period. So this method captures the real world device utilization across the fleet, as some devices are typically used more heavily than others. It shows the CO2 emission in kilograms by paper size, A4 letter, A3 ledger, and it also takes into account, obviously, for duplex printing. So the chart shows the total annual carbon footprint, and again, you can filter up here by department if you wanted to. So again, if I wanted to look at this by department, or if I wanted to look at it by output, device type, model, etc. If we filter by department, let's do that. So I'm going to filter on, say, this one department here. And so this would be the expected carbon footprint for this particular department. And then I could double click on this number here, and that would open up a list of those devices in that department, and that would give us the footprint for those devices in that department. So that's a neat way to kind of drill down and get the information that might be vital to you when you go into your mitigation process. So now let's take a look at mitigation, or what's called the tree offset chart. So here we can see this is the number of trees that are required to be planted if you want to get to a carbon neutral print environment. The offset is based on the amount of carbon a tree can offset in 1 year, 20 years, which is the half-life, or 40 years, which is the whole life, and it considers the carbon emission produced from some using plain paper, and again it counts for the duplex printing as well. If the sustainability goal is to offset the carbon footprint in a year, the chart provides the amount of monthly trees that have to be planted. You can see that the trees here would be, if you want to offset everything in a year, then you'd need to have 65 for March. And the offset applies if the goal for a carbon neutral environment. Again, you can look at that in terms of whether your goal is to have a neutral environment 20 years or 40 years. And so there's a couple other things you could do, and this is really not on the chart here, but certainly when you're going through your mitigation process, again, the overall goal here is to get to a carbon neutral environment, and you can use the tool in order to do these periodic audits. It's a repeatable process. And so in this case, we're looking at how many trees have to be planted. But another thing to consider in the overall mitigation plan is that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, estimates that on average 70% of office paper is recycled. But by recycling more of this paper, you add an additional mitigation step. So not only planting trees, but if you were to increase the amount of paper that's recycled, that there's an estimate by the American and Canadian Forest Products Association that suggests that if you were to go from that average of 70% of recycled paper to 85%, then you could reduce the carbon footprint by 25%. That's significant. So not just planting trees, but also recycling is an important step you want to consider for mitigation. Another, of course, area for sustainability is power usage, and so that the next set of charts will look at fleet consumption, energy consuming models, and the cost to print versus the power cost as well. So let's take a look at the projected annual power by manufacturer. Now this chart is the projected annual power. It shows the power consumption by manufacturer. So the chart takes into account all the devices in the current fleet by manufacturer and then ranks them by their average power consumption. The ranking's based on the average annual power, so that's the kilowatts used. Power consumption is calculated by using the device utilization and the TEC rating, and that is the hours percent used, okay, and the TEC power consumption. Those are if they're known values. Otherwise, you go back to the parameters and you can set those default values based on the device type, whether it's a multifunction or single function device or other type of device. And the device utilization considers the actual device output in relationship to its expected low utilization. And so we know a device's low utilization that comes when you install SiteAudit. There's some data that is installed also that gives us what the monthly low utilization for a device is by model, and it's high, and we're using the low utilization. And then these values are normalized to provide the projected annual power consumption by manufacturer. Now I can look at this chart here and I see I've got all the manufacturers here at the top of the list. Let's say this brother would be the one that's consuming the most power. I could double click on this number again like I did before, and this would show me those brother devices that are representative of the ones here that's consuming the most power. And then you can consider what you want to do with those devices based upon this list right here. Now let's move on to the next chart, which looks at the top 10 energy consumption ratio, and that's the top energy consumption chart. Looks at the relationship between the power cost, that's using the kilowatts and printing, and the print cost. The print cost is coming from cost that was used in SiteAudit through the viewer you add in with the cost per pages and other things. And a device with an expensive power cost, that's based on its kilowatt cost, its utilization, and TEC rating. But let's say it has a low print cost. That is the sum of its supplies, its rental and service cost. That's the print cost. It will show a high energy consumption ratio. Okay, and this means that the device requires a lot of energy cost to produce its output. Okay, so we can see that here in these top 10 here. So it lists those top 10 energy consuming devices relative to its print costs, and then you could do something about those. So you've identified which models they are, where they're located, and then again you can incorporate this into your mitigation plan. So the chart looks at the individual devices, and now let's turn to more of a sort of a general power use chart, and that's this one, which is looking at the top model for power usage. And here the top 10 power by model chart shows a normalized power use, so annual by model. as a monthly trend. So you'd see this over the time you've been monitoring. It identifies the top 10 models in the current fleet that number the most and with the highest TEC rating. The annual TEC rating, again, that's the energy consumption, fleet consumption, is summed and multiplied by the number of devices of that given model. The chart is used to identify which models generate the most power use, sort of as an aggregate, and you can filter again by department to illustrate the power contribution of these devices to a departmental cost, for example. And this may lead to reallocating those devices to more evenly distribute the power consumption and cost within the fleet. Now let's look at the last chart here, and that's the one that looks at power cost relative to print cost. Now the cost comparison chart illustrates the relationship between print cost and energy cost. And print costs are those, again, it comes from SiteAudit, which you've added through the SiteAudit viewer, that look at the supplies costs, the rent or amortization, service cost, and then it looks at the energy costs, and those again are based on the kilowatt charge and the device use. And comparing the two show the relative contribution of each to the overall cost on a monthly basis. And this is a month-to-month variance, can show the usage of high or low power cost devices to print cost. For example, a month with a lower print cost compared to previous months with a high energy cost month suggests that more output was generated on the high energy cost devices than in the previous months, all total costs being the same. So print costs are set, again, as I mentioned, the cost configuration menu of the SiteAudit viewer, and you can change those. And once you bring in the data into the report, those variables will change as well. So you use this chart typically to measure the effectiveness of sustainability actions over time. And as more mitigation steps are taken, the relative trend of energy cost to print cost should go down. And thus you're showing progress to a carbon neutral print environment. So let me just sum here, and then I'll show you one last thing about how you can present this with a PowerPoint presentation that's linked to these charts. So again, the purpose of using the Green Audit is twofold. One is that you want to identify the current fleet's carbon footprint, the power consumption cost, and then what actions can be taken to reduce the footprint via offsets and fleet adjustments. This essentially creates a yardstick by which progress towards a carbon neutral print environment over time can be measured. And these MPS providers or end users actually could do this. Requires the analyzer seat license in the Green reports, and you can get those by contacting licensing at netaphor.com. Now let's look at one other thing here. So I've got all my charts here. Lots of ways I could do navigation here as I go back to the dashboard, etc. But what else is neat about this is that it comes with a ready to use PowerPoint presentation. And as long as they're in the same folder, this is the Green report and this is the PowerPoint presentation, that all I need to do is hit this update links, which I'm not going to do right now, but I would if I wanted to update my presentation. I'll just hit cancel here for now. And what it does is it brings in all those charts that you were working on before. And again, here's that dashboard that we looked at a few minutes ago. Here's the trend for emissions. This is the annual. This is the trees that need to be planted, etc. So this all covers everything that was in the charts, and that's how you would use the charts and then go to the presentation step, which then allow you to go right to the end customer, whoever is going to be the audience for this presentation. So all folded, having all this linked together and all these charts put together for you should reduce the cost in order to create a presentation for a sustainability program. And that's how you use the green reports.